It's been said that to expect life to treat you fairly because you're a good person is like expecting a bull not to charge you because you're a vegetarian. It doesn't exactly work that way. But most of us want to believe in a world that's fair and a God that's just. Most of us want to believe that everything happens for a reason, that what comes around goes around, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, that good deeds accumulate good karma, that good things come to those who wait, and that all is well for those who love the Lord. It would be nice if any of these formulas or formulations actually worked. But let's talk about that. Today I want to examine and expose why life is just not fair. Most people want to believe that there is a rational and at least reliable formula that we can follow in order to ensure that good things happen and that ward off bad things. Otherwise, it seems like God is a monster and that life is arbitrary and that we are all vulnerable to the whims of a random, unjust, and indiscriminate world. Are we? When I say life is unfair, what do you see? I see a mother who carried her son for 9 months in her womb and who wiped finger paints off the molding around the bedroom door at age 4 and ketchup off the refrigerator handle at age 13 and who shivered in the cold bleachers while cheering him on the football field throughout high school, and who wiped away his tears when the girl he asked to prom said no and broke his tender heart. I see that mother on graduation day giving him a big bear hug full of hope and expectation. And then I see her shattered face when she learns that he will not return from his 4th tour as a reservist in Afghanistan. As most of the other families greet their sons and daughters coming home, she sits in her living room chair with the picture of her son in her hands, crying, wondering if our military venture into Afghanistan is even serving any valuable purpose. Feeling cheated that there won't be a wedding day, that she won't hold grandchildren in her hands, that she'll never smell the scent of his hair again or be able to look into his eyes and tell him, I love you, and to hear him tell her that he loves her. When I think of unfair, I see the face of a father whose wife and 7-year-old daughter were killed by a drunk driver, even though the one who drank and drove survived. I think of the kind-hearted young girl who loved dressing up in flowing dresses and sparkly plastic jewelry, who had an attitude of complete freedom and abandon until her innocence was violated by a relative who was supposed to be taking care of her. When I think of the world being unfair, I see the airplane mechanic and his wife and their 3 children loading blankets and the family dog into their pickup truck because they're moving in with his mother because after 20 years, he's been laid off, downsized, and he's lost his home and all their equity and their life savings in the economic downturn and the mortgage debacle. And I see them listening, powerless, to the news as they learn that their tax dollars and ours were now being used not to help families like them who've been doing everything right, but to bail out banks whose presidents got us into the debacle and who received multi-million-dollar bonuses with our tax dollars. When I think of unfair, I think of the images on the television screen of parents of Sandy Hook Elementary School after the school shooting. Remember those? I see the girls and women of northern Pakistan who are not allowed to get an education and who live under the fear and tyranny of male domination. I can't help but think of the many, many boys and girls who are tricked into prostitution and slavery every week in this country and all over the world. I see a mother being told by her preacher that her gay son is a sinner and is going to hell. And I see her tortured by having to decide between her love for Jesus and her love for her son. And I see her son trying to explain to his children why their grandmother won't visit or have anything to do with their family. When I think of unfair, I see so many bad things that happen to good people for no apparent reason. It makes me wonder, is God a monster? Or is God a fantasy? Or is there any justice or fairness in this earthly existence? And is the only way that anybody can believe in God requires accepting that there must be an afterlife for divine justice to happen, because in this world, too often it doesn't. Every religion and every person has an answer or a way of coping with the horrors and the inequities of this human condition of ours. And yet there is so much bad theology out there that religion and beliefs often compound people's pain rather than comfort them. Let's look at some of the religious ideas in our pop culture and in some of the religions that we hear. Ways that they respond to the inexplicable evil and injustice and tragedy of our world. Keep in mind, though, that most of this is really about dealing with our deep need to be in control. The boy whose dad dies suddenly of a heart attack because, well, he doesn't know why, but he thinks it might be because a few weeks ago, when he was mad at his dad, he went into his room and he was wishing that his dad would just die. And he thinks God is trying to teach him a lesson. Or the woman grappling with the deadening shock of a stillborn child on a day that was supposed to be the greatest day of her and her husband's life. And she thinks deep down and subconsciously that it might have been her ambivalence about whether she'd be a good mother that has caused this catastrophe to happen. As torturous and as self-incriminating as these ideas are, these are the kinds of responses that many people have in a tragedy. Why me? And we try to come up with some answer, no matter how tortured. Because at least it answers the demand as to why. And it gives people a sense of control. As Dr. Elaine Pagels once wrote, many people would rather feel guilty than feel powerless. If we can be a good person and do everything we're supposed to do and still face devastation, then it's a pretty scary world we live in. People want to believe that if they remain faithful in their marriage, or by coming to church, by paying their tithe regularly, that their faithfulness will be rewarded. Because if our beliefs and our actions, they can't provide us with some protection, some guarantees against the worst, then what's the point? But what if it's all just superstition? What if it's all just a mental game we play with ourselves so that we can fend off the fear and darkness of this terrestrial existence of ours? A baby girl is born without legs, and people say, it's unfair. Why her? And the Hindu says it's her karma from a past life. The idea of karma from past lives, it helps a believer feel that, well, at least life is fair and God is just and it's all happening for some larger purpose. However, this simplistic version of Eastern philosophy blames the victim. Is a little girl who's raped, is it her karma from a past life? Come on, that's just bad theology. It's a theology that was created by upper Hindus that were very, very rich, watching a lot of poor people living and suffering around them, and they needed some philosophy to help them deal with it all and feel okay about their lives. But it's been translated into our very materialistic and wealthy culture into a way that a lot of people see why other people are suffering. But if we follow this theology to its conclusion, it means that the Native American men, women, and children who were slaughtered on the Trail of Tears, well, it was a karmic debt that they were paying from a past life. Obviously, had to be. You mean to tell me that they were the bad ones? That they deserve it because of something that they had done due to the laws of karma? Forget it. This is bad theology. It's irresponsible and it's reckless. The same thing goes for many Christians who believe it's all just part of God's plan. So God's plan involves things like little children being gassed to death in Syria, or gnawed to death by a pit bull, or violated by an uncle or a priest or their own father, or ripped out of the hands of their mother by a tornado or a tsunami. What kind of God do these people worship? Let's look at the Bible to see if it can give us any clues. The best place to start on this subject is the book of Job. It's been claimed that Job was the first existentialist because he questioned the isolation of humanity in a hostile universe and then discovered that there were no answers. If anyone knows about suffering and evil and the capriciousness of God and life, it's Job. It says, "There lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright and feared God and shunned evil." In today's parlance, we would say that he was honest. He went to church every week. He paid his tithe regularly and completely. And we're told that he had 10 children. He had an adoring wife and a lot of property and the utmost respect in the community. And then in chapter 6 it says, "One day the angels came to present themselves before God, and Satan also came with them." When it begins, God seems to be gloating a bit about his child, Job. Satan says to God, "Well, yeah, sure he's faithful. Look how you've blessed him. Take away all the blessings and he'll curse you to your face." So God says in Hebrew, "Oh yeah?" And Satan says back, "Yeah. Think about it, God. You've created a moral welfare system. If people are good and they praise you, it's not because they love you, it's because you reward them. If you stop rewarding them, they won't love you anymore. People aren't good for goodness sake. They're doing it for the booty. They're a bunch of takers." "Not my Job," God says. "Are you kidding?" Satan replies. "You don't know a welfare junkie when you see one. Give me a few weeks with him and he'll be cursing your name." "Okay," says God. "I'll take the bet. If you're so smart, Satan, do whatever you will to him. Just whatever you do, don't kill him." Now let's pause right here for a minute in this story. How can anyone believe this story in a literal sense? Think about it. First of all, if God is all knowledgeable, wouldn't God already know what was going to happen? Why would God have to prove this or anything to Satan? Do people really believe that God makes wagers with the devil? Do people really believe that God is so insecure that God can be goaded into letting Satan torture an honorable man and kill his children because that's what's about to happen? Satan wipes out all of Job's 10 kids in one day. Now, what kind of immoral God stands by and allows the killing of innocent people just to prove a point? I want to argue that this story is actually not about God, as it is a story about the record of the ancient human struggle to wrestle with the question of why bad things happen to good people. When Job remains faithful after the death of his children, God says, "See, I told you so." And Satan replies, "Oh, I'm only getting started. May I please continue?" And God says, "Go for it. Do anything you want to him." Just don't kill him. Now, if this were really about God, this would be a very heartless God. So next, Satan afflicts Job with sores and pus all over his body and aching and intense pain. And at this point, Job's friends, they start to come around, presumably to comfort him. And they lay out some of the same bad theologies that we hear all the time today. His friends assume that Job must have done something to deserve it. I mean, these things don't just happen. I mean, he didn't use the word karma, but we might. Job protests, I've done nothing wrong. I am a good and faithful man. But Job, everything happens for a reason. God doesn't. He does these things to teach us something. You have something to learn. You can't just keep thinking you're so good. Job says, wait a minute, I am generous, I am observant, I am an upstanding person. How could I need a lesson so badly that it requires the killing of all my children? Especially when we see wicked and immoral people all around us who have their children and their health. It makes no sense. Where's the justice? His friends tell him, now be careful, Job. Protesting that you are good and did nothing wrong, you're slandering God. Because God is always good and God is always just. You must have done something. Job didn't do anything. As someone who has lost a child myself, I can tell you that people, when they come around to offer comfort, sometimes they say some of the most painful things. They don't mean to. But you hear people come around and they say things like, well, God must have needed another little girl up in heaven. She's with her heavenly Father now. And things like that. What would heaven be like without little kids running around? And it's all part of God's will. God has a plan for your life, and it will all make sense eventually. This was no comfort at all. These were just things people were saying to make themselves feel better. Not me, because it didn't make me feel better at all. For me, what helped were people who just came around, just came to be with me, sit with me, pray with me, hold my hand. Just people who could just say, yeah, this is miserable. I am so sorry. It's all that's needed, not some explanation of why and what it means. Now, in the story of Job, he finally becomes so incensed at his friends that he eventually demands an answer from God. And to God's credit, in the story, God comes down to answer Job. It's the least God can do after Job maintained his faith through all that had happened to him. And God says in some of the most poetic words in the entire Bible, which I will paraphrase, "Who are you to question me? You have no idea what it's like to be God. You could not possibly understand, and you never will. I don't owe you an explanation, and I'm not about to give you one. You wouldn't understand it if I did. Just do as I say and don't ask why." Now, Job was angry, and Job was disappointed, but Job wasn't stupid, so he did what he was supposed to do, and when the story ends, we're told that God restored his health, gave him 10 new children and 10 times the riches he had before. Kind of a Hollywood ending, actually. But even though God gave him a new family, there are some losses that even God can't mend. There are some suffering and sorrow that even God can't ease. That Job might have had a new family, but beneath his rejoicing, there would always be a grief for the ones he loved and lost. In the end, this is not so much a tale about God as it is a tale of the human condition. In this world, wicked people sometimes prosper and have long, healthy, and successful lives, while good and decent people suffer. And to its credit, this story does a great job of debunking one by one many of the terrible theologies we hear all the time. It debunks the whole idea of a moral welfare system. You know, it says in the Bible that we were created in God's image. But when you read the book of Job, you realize that we also create God in our image. At the beginning, God's bragging and gloating about his wonderful child, Job. Then God becomes insecure in the face of some questioning about his value to those who love him. And then God gets goaded into a wager with the devil. And God willfully, albeit passively, participates in the killing and the suffering of innocents. But one thing that God does not do is try to answer the question, why? This is one of the few books in the whole Bible where God speaks directly to a human being. It is a moment more than any other moment in the entire Scriptures that if God is going to explain why, this would be the moment to do it. But no. The Bible gives God incredibly poetic lines, but neither Job nor we get an explanation of why. If nothing else, this book is a reminder that why is the wrong question. There is no answer to the question of why bad things happen to good people, why life is unfair so much of the time. The more appropriate question begins with the word because. Because life is unfair, what are we called to do? What if we just admit that we really don't know why and we never will? What should we do then? We'd have to do the only thing that makes any sense in the face of evil and tragedy and injustice. The only response that has any significance at all is love. We are called to love, no matter how painful it is to love and care. The pain is inevitable, and yet we are called in the midst of it all to continue to risk loving and receiving love. In this unfair world, we are called to be instruments of love. And the only God that makes any sense to believe in is a God whose will is love. So that when a person prays, "Let me be an instrument of thy will," we are asking to be an instrument of selfless love. In a famous passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 in the Christian scriptures, it says, "Now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love." Love is the greatest because even when we've lost our faith, and even when we feel there is absolutely no hope, we can still love and be open to love. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, because thou art with me." Some years ago, God reached out hands to bless me and my family. And those hands were connected to dozens of people who look a lot like you. Such are the hands of love that transform the broken hearts of those who face life's inequity.